Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. He wasn't sure why he had accepted the job. Maybe it was the absurd pay or the fact that, after months of searching for jobs without success, my options had run out. What I did know was that, from the first day I set foot in that old factory, something told me that I shouldn't be there. The factory was called Northern Industrial Metals, or something like that. The name was engraved on a rusty plaque that hung precariously above the front door. The building itself had been abandoned for years, or so I thought. The windows were dirty, many of them broken, and the huge metal gates hung from their hinges, as if they had been forced many times. My job was to review and catalog the old inventory that was still inside since the company had sold the building to a construction company that planned to demolish it to make condominiums. I was supposed to go in, review the remaining material, and make a list of what could be salvaged. It seemed simple, but there was one detail that they didn't tell me in the interview. Nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to go in there. On the first day, I reached the place around 8 a.m. I was surprised that there was no surveillance or other people working on the process. Everything was my responsibility. Once I entered the building, the silence was deafening. I could almost hear my own breath bouncing off the metal walls of the factory. The echo of my steps was the only thing that accompanied me. The first part of the factory was a large empty space, where the largest machines must have been. As I walked forward, the smell of rusty metal and rancid oil grew stronger. Light barely came in through the dirty windows, and the few fluorescent lamps that still hung from the ceiling flickered intermittently. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating. It wasn't just the dust or the feeling of abandonment, but something deeper, something he couldn't explain. It was as if the place itself was breathing, as if there was something in the shadows hiding and watching me. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought I was losing my mind. I was in one of the older sections of the factory, going through some boxes when suddenly a low, distant sound made me stop. It was as if someone, far away, was speaking in a low voice, whispering unintelligible words. I turned off the flashlight and listened. For a few seconds, the sound disappeared, and I became convinced it was just the wind seeping through the cracks in the building. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A mix of murmurs and deep breaths, as if someone was whispering right behind me. I turned around suddenly, shining my flashlight in all directions. But there was no one, only the darkness and immovable shadows of the factory. I decided that was enough for the day. I packed my things and left there, feeling a strange weight on my chest that didn't go away until I was out of the building. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of whispers kept echoing in my head, and for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about that factory. There was absolutely no reason to go back, but I knew I had to. Something attracted me to that place, although I didn't understand what it was. The next day I returned. The atmosphere was even more oppressive than before, and this time the silence was almost painful. I got to work going through more old boxes and tools. As I worked, my mind wandered to the history of the place. No one had told me much about the factory, but its sudden abandonment had always seemed strange to me. According to some rumors he had heard, something terrible had happened here years ago, but no one knew for sure what. Around noon, while I was organizing some old papers, I heard the whispers again. This time they were clearer, as if someone was right next to me, mumbling something in a language I didn't understand. A chill ran down my spine. I turned around slowly, hoping to find someone. But there was only me. I gathered my courage and decided to follow the sound. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe a sense of need to confront whatever was happening. The whispers guided me to a rusty door I had never noticed before. It was at the back of a storage room, partially covered by shelves. I hesitated before opening it. Something inside me told me not to do it, that whatever was behind that door was not to be discovered. But I did it anyway. Behind the door, there was a staircase that descended into a dark basement. The air was thick, and a dense humidity permeated the atmosphere. I descended slowly, flashlight in hand, carefully illuminating each step. The sound of whispers increased with every step he took, and soon they were no longer just whispers. It was a mixture of voices, cries, and muffled screams. I felt how my breathing accelerated and how sweat began to run down my forehead. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found a metal door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see a faint flickering light inside. I took a deep breath and pushed the door carefully. What I saw inside left me paralyzed. It was a large, dark room with cracked concrete walls. In the center, there was a huge machine, rusty and covered in dust. But the most disturbing thing was not the machine, but what was around it, human figures. At first, I thought they were mannequins, but as I got closer, I realized they were bodies, or what was left of them. They were sitting in chairs, lined up in front of the machine, with their heads tilted back and their mouths open in a silent scream. Their empty eyes stared at the ceiling, and a mixture of terror and agony could be read on their faces. The stench of death and decay filled the air, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from vomiting. I backed away, tripping over my own feet, when a sound made me stop in my tracks. One of the bodies moved. I don't know how it was possible, but I saw how one of those bodies, the one closest to the machine, slowly turned its head towards me. His jaw moved strangely, as if he were trying to speak, but the only thing that came out of his mouth was a faint whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to understand. "Don't leave us!" My body reacted before my mind. I ran out of that room, up the stairs as fast as I could, and without looking back, I crossed the factory until I reached the exit. The echo of the whispers followed me, as if the walls themselves were repeating the words of those bodies. "Don't leave us!" I got into the car and drove aimlessly, getting as far away from the factory as possible. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was trying to process what I had seen, but I couldn't find a logical explanation for it. Who were those people? What had happened to them? And what was that damn machine? That night I didn't come home. I slept in a cheap motel on the other side of town, but the dreams gave me no respite. I dreamed of the factory, of the bodies, of the machine. In my dreams, the machine started up, and the bodies began to move, crawling towards me while whispering my name. I woke up drenched in sweat, with the feeling that I was not alone. The sound of whispers still echoed in my ears. That same morning I quit work. I called the construction company, and told them I would never set foot in that place again. I didn't give them any explanations. I didn't need to do it. Despite everything, the factory did not let me. For weeks, I felt like something was watching me, even when I was at home. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I could hear those same whispers, soft but persistent, like a distant echo. A few months later, I read in the news that the company that had bought the factory had decided to stop the demolition plans. Apparently, several workers had resigned after reporting strange experiences inside the building. The factory was abandoned again, and with it, the secrets it hid. But I know the truth. I know something was left down there, in that dark room, waiting. And the worst thing is that every time I close my eyes, I hear the echo of their voices. Don't leave us. Before continuing, if you enjoy my content, leave your like, subscribe, and tell me at what time you dare to listen to these macabre. Now, without further interruptions, let's continue. Ready for the next story? I had always worked in factories. The deafening noise of the machines, the smell of hot metal, and the dust floating in the air were my daily bread. However, when the plant I had been in for more than 15 years closed, I was forced to accept a job in a factory that everyone in town knew about, but that no one wanted to talk about. Saldrich Mechanics. I had heard rumors about that place. Stories that circulated in taverns, at family gatherings, but I never paid much attention to them. After all, there were always people who were afraid of what they didn't understand. But when I first arrived at that factory, something inside me warned me that I didn't belong there. The factory had been closed for more than 30 years. They said a series of unexplained incidents had forced the company to close its doors. Although it was never made public, the most widespread rumor was that several workers had disappeared without a trace. However, with demand increasing in the metal industry, the plant had reopened under new management. The fact that they were desperate to hire people and pay very well was enough to make me ignore any superstitions. The first time I entered the factory, the place felt suffocating. It wasn't so much the atmosphere, but the feeling that something was wrong, as if the very structure of the building wanted to expel me. The industrial warehouse was immense, much larger than it seemed from the outside. The old machines, although rusty, were fully operational. The air was thick with a mixture of oil and mold, and the echo of the machines resonated like a constant whisper in the background. The team of workers was small, just about 10 people. There were no familiar faces, but they all seemed subdued. Nobody talked much, except for what was strictly necessary. It was as if something in that place had drained any desire for human interaction. My first weeks were normal. I was assigned to one of the hydraulic presses in the west section of the plant. Everything was going on with monotonous normality. But it was in the third week when things began to happen that I couldn't explain. It was a Tuesday night, and they had put me on the night shift, which almost no one wanted to take. I still didn't understand why, but with the salary they offered, I didn't mind working at night. That night, however, the atmosphere was different. There was no wind outside, but the large windows vibrated, as if something was pressing from the other side. The sound of the machines, which was normally a constant roar, seemed quieter, as if someone had adjusted the volume. Halfway through the shift, while checking one of the presses, I heard it for the first time. A scream. It came from somewhere deep in the factory, beyond the areas I had access to. At first I thought maybe one of the other workers had had an accident, but when I asked on the radio, no one reported anything. In fact, they all seemed irritated by my question, as if I had mentioned something they preferred not to hear. I ignored what happened, but that same night, I heard the scream again. This time much clearer. What made my blood run cold was not the sound, but what I felt when I heard it. A presence. A feeling that I was not alone, that something or someone was watching me from the shadows. The days passed, and each night of work in the factory became more disturbing. I often found myself glancing at the shadows, hoping to see something move, but every time I focused my eyes, there was nothing. The lights flickered constantly, and the noises of the machines began to seem more human to me. It was as if the presses and drills were not only producing metal, but were replicating screams and wails. Crazy, I told myself, but I couldn't ignore that feeling. One night, while I was alone in the western area, I decided to investigate on my own. There wasn't much traffic in that part of the factory, and the supervisor wasn't keeping an eye on us, so I ventured to a section that had been closed since I started. The metal doors that led to that part were sealed, but with a little force, I managed to open them. Inside, the air was much heavier, the lights didn't work well, and the floor was covered in dust. The machinery on that side of the factory was completely dead, rusted, as if it hadn't been touched in years. I walked through the hallways, shining my flashlight into the dark corners, feeling a growing pressure in my chest, as if the very air were charged with something evil. Just as I was about to return, I heard the whispers. At first, they were like a distant echo, barely audible over the sound of my breathing. But as he went on, the whispers became clearer, more defined. They were voices, multiple, speaking in unison. I didn't understand what they were saying, but I didn't need to feel the fear they caused me. It was like they were right next to me, and when I turned my head, I saw something that made me freeze. A few meters away, in the center of the room, stood a figure. She was human, or at least she looked like it, but she wasn't moving. She was just standing motionless, staring in my direction. Darkness covered much of his body, but I could see his face, pale, with empty eyes that seemed to reflect the light of my flashlight in an unnatural way. I backed away slowly, but the figure did not move. I felt like time stopped for a moment. My body reacted before my mind, and I ran, tripping over abandoned tools and machinery along the way. I didn't stop until I reached the door I had forced open. When I looked back, the figure was gone, but the whispers still echoed in my ears. I didn't say anything to the other workers about what I saw. I was afraid that they would take me for crazy, and the truth is that I wasn't even sure what had happened. But from that night on, the factory was no longer the same for me. The sounds of the machines seemed more chaotic, as if the gears and pistons were replicating the screams and murmurs I heard that night. Sometimes when I was alone, I could feel something watching me from the shadows, something that did not belong to this world. It wasn't until a week later that I finally worked up the courage to ask one of my oldest colleagues, a man named Gustavo, about what was going on. He was a reserved guy, almost always silent. But that night, after our shift, I approached him while we were changing in the locker room. "Gustavo," I said, trying to sound casual, "have you ever heard anything strange at the factory?" At first he didn't respond. He looked at me with his tired eyes and looked down at his trembling hands, as if he were deciding whether he should tell me the truth. Finally, he let out a sigh and spoke in a low voice. "We've all heard it," he said. His voice was barely a murmur. "The screams, the whispers. We see them too. The shadows." I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't believe there were others experiencing the same thing. "What is happening here?" I asked him. "What the hell is this?" Gustavo remained silent for a long moment, as if the words weighed him down. "Years ago, when the factory first closed, it wasn't for lack of business," he began. "There were accidents, many accidents, but some of us knew they weren't just accidents. Something here, something in this place. It's not good. Some say the owners did something, a deal or worse, and those who stayed were trapped here. Now they just want us to let them go." His explanation left me cold. Could it be possible? Could this factory be a cursed place, where the souls of those who died were trapped, repeating their last moments over and over again? That same night, I decided not to return. No matter how much they paid, it wasn't worth risking my sanity or my life. But before I left, I went to the supervisor's office to leave my resignation letter. The supervisor, a large man with a thick beard, was going through some paperwork. "Can't you leave?" he said without looking at me, as if he already knew why I was there. "I'm sorry, but I can't continue working here," I replied, trying to stay calm. "This place is not normal." The supervisor looked up, and for the first time I noticed something in his eyes. Something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "You saw them, right?" he asked me in a low voice. I didn't answer. It wasn't necessary. "No one can escape from this place," he whispered. "If you saw them, they will follow you. They are trapped, and now they will drag you with them." That was the last conversation I had before leaving that damn factory. I ran to my car and didn't look back. Since that night, I've tried to avoid anything that reminds me of the factory, but the whispers haven't left me. Sometimes I hear them in the dark when I'm alone. Other times I see shadows moving in the corners of my house. I know something from that place followed me. No matter how far I go, I know they will come for me. I listen to you, closer every day, whispering, expecting, and I know that soon they will come for you too.